Hi, everyone. Hello. This is very low down. It makes me feel like I'm confessing to something. Confessing to being working class. I can be here? Does this work? Okay, sort of into that there. Hello, and welcome to the inaugural Working Class Writers Festival, a celebration of writers who may well buck the norm, but have certainly always existed. Shout out to John Keats, in the sky, #1. So thank you for joining us. Today's event is called Tackling Inequality, and it's been hosted by the wonderful publishers Policy Press. All our panel are published on Policy Press, and I will be shamelessly promoting all of their books, so please be warned about that. In general, we're going to be looking at inequality across all areas, including poverty, race, just the notion of elitism and what is an elite, and of course Britishness, which couldn't be a more, sadly, a more pressing question in this time of Brexit to land. If you're wondering who I am, my name's Coco Khan. I'm a writer from East London, where I was born. That's before it was cool, by the way. It was just more when it was a kind of general public health concern, those sort of times. But these days, my work is mostly journalistic. I'm a columnist for The Guardian, although I do write in other places, just anywhere that's like not Tory and will pay. That's kind of my area. And beyond that, I also do a bit of creative writing. So my interest at the moment is in gentrification. I grew up in social housing, so it's a story, a sad story very close to my heart. So I'm currently working on a dark comedy about that. In general, I like to write about just people that are not written enough about. So women of colour, I was trying to think of the word I could describe, and I was saying to my other half on the way down, I was like, I guess I could describe it as chavs, especially inspired by my own background and from a council house. And what a vehicle we had, a Renault Clio in beige, thank you. It was it was not the 70s, like it shouldn't have been beige, but anyway. But they don't really say that word about black and brown people. So I think they say hoodies. So I would describe my work as hoodies, aunties, and bleeding heart millennials. So that's me. Anyway, before I introduce the panel, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So the audio from this event is going to be recorded, and it's going to be shared on SoundCloud. So no swearing, no abusive statements. I'm sure it was a very nice crowd, it wouldn't happen. And the event is also being filmed. The footage will be released on YouTube in mid-November. So any abusive comments in the YouTube video, please defend us, because you know what YouTube's like. Throughout this, well, actually, no, halfway through this, a QR code is going to appear. That's a link to a survey. If you enjoyed this session, please say. If you enjoyed any of the sessions, please say, because that survey is going to help them get funding to do it next year and to keep this growing hub and celebration of working class writing going. So that would be much appreciated. And also straight after this is a speed pitching event. I think that's what it's called. So if you have an idea for a book, have an idea for a long-form journalistic text, if you have an idea for a script, there'll be people from the industry, from all those kind of corners, who can give you a little bit of advice. Hey, I'd love to hear that something got even signed. So the space is on that. If that's of interest to you, find someone in a red T-shirt that says class on it, and ask them to join the event. Okay, so enough of me. I'm going to introduce our speakers. They're each going to speak for 5 minutes, and then I'll open up the floor to your questions. There'll be a mic that comes around, so we can organise it that way. So I'm just going to read it from this piece of paper, because I've written notes, and I think they're good notes. So to my left, we've got Paul Sung. He is a filmmaker with British and Chinese heritage, fellow Londoner, I just found out in the green room. His work is driven by you say that for me, Paul. Methodical. It's methodical, everyone. It's methodical research, creative storytelling, and a collaborative approach that strives for inclusivity and diversity. His documentaries have been broadcast on national television, screened internationally, and they include Dispossession, The Great Social Housing Swindle, and Polystyrene, I'm a Cliché. He is the editor of 2 narrative photography books, Invisible Britain, Portraits of Hope and Resilience, and This Separated Isle, published by Policy Press. First plug. On my far right here, we have Yunis Alam. Is it Alam?
Either.
He's so cool about it. And in the room, I was like, what should I say?
I've been called worse.
How should I introduce you? He was like, I'll just make it up. I was like, pole dancing? I don't know. Like, what do you, yeah. But, so, I mean, everything I'm going to say is true, but please enter your own your own details for fun. So he was born and lives in Bradford. He's worked as a sociologist at the University of Bradford for over 20 years. He's researching and teaching in various subjects, but he's primarily focused on representation, ethnography, ethnic relations, and popular culture. In his own words, he drifted into academia, and before that, he was in proper jobs, which is a nice thing to say. You know you're in a safe space when you can say that. And that includes a textile mill, and wasn't there another one? What was the other one you mentioned?
I sold vacuum cleaners.
Right. Sold vacuum cleaners.
I could still sell one now.
Oh.
I was that good at it, but it was morally problematic. So
Well-
I kind of stopped it after about 2 weeks. It was just a weird business. Sorry.
Well, Yunis, challenge accepted. I hope to hear you flogging some vax by the end. His more recent academic work explores the relationships between ethnicity, racism, class, gender taste, and cars, situated particularly within the context of multi-ethnic urban spaces. His book, Race, Taste, Class, and Cars, was published by Policy Press last year. And then, hi, Stewart. I actually didn't get to speak to Stewart in the green room, so I'm afraid I have no additional details, but you're going to tell us some, right? So Stewart Lansley is visiting fellow in the School of Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. He's a council member of the Progressive Economy Forum and a research associate at the Compass think tank. He is the author of The Richer, the Poorer, How Britain Enriched the Few and Failed the Poor, which will be published by, I don't need to tell you, Policy Press next month. Hi, Stewart. I'm sorry I don't have any additional facts, but maybe you could tell us one about you.
Well, I've had a very mixed history, really. I've worked in television, I've worked in newspapers, and worked in academia, but all my work really has been about wealth, poverty, and inequality. So I haven't really deviated from that very much. Probably.
Well, I hope to see you buying a vacuum cleaner shortly. And our final panelist, unfortunately, couldn't join us. It's Mary O'Hara. She's an award-winning journalist, author, and producer. Her journalism appears in publications including The Guardian and Mosaic Science. She's the author of 2 books, The Shame Game, Overturning the Toxic Poverty Narrative, you know who it's published by, and Austerity Bites, Journey to the Sharp End of the Cuts in the UK. She's a founder of the multi-platform anti-poverty initiative, Project Twist It, and has produced and directed a number of short films. She runs a comedy club. Blimey, Mary. She's been an Alistair Cook Fulbright Scholar at UC Berkeley and a producer, booker, and consultant on Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness, who is from Queer Eye. Did not expect that final one, not going to lie. Unfortunately, she is unable to join us today, but she has sent us a short video. She'll be available on Twitter from 5 p.m. if anyone has any follow-up questions. We're actually gutted that she couldn't be here today, so very, very sorry about that. Her Twitter handle is Mary O'Hara1, and I will now leave you to her.
Hi everybody. First of all, my apologies for not being able to be physically present on the panel today. I was really looking forward to being at the festival, to being on this panel, to hearing people's questions and to seeing everybody interact. Thanks to the vagaries of the US immigration system, I'm sort of stuck where I am for the moment. I also want to thank Natasha and the entire team for establishing this festival, for making it happen, for providing a place for people from working class backgrounds to have their voices heard, to interact, to discuss the various different issues that affect them, and especially to people who want to be writers or in publishing and feel that they are historically and today still excluded from those environments. So thank you very much for that. The panel that you are sitting in front of are pretty expert at the stuff that this panel is designed for, so I'll be as brief as I possibly can. I grew up in poverty. Growing up in poverty does give you a certain perspective on the world that you live in, on the society that you live in. I grew up at a time when the welfare system was much more robust than the one that we currently have, but even then I understood the stigma and shame of poverty. I understood that society and its institutions were tilted in favour of the better off and people further up the income scale than me or my family or anybody like us. This has informed my work over the years. It's informed my 2 books, Austerity Bites and The Shame Game, and my journalism. I've learned an awful lot through talking to people who have had to survive under the current benefits system. And it appalls me that all these years after I was a young person, so many people are still denied access to things that everyone else in society is. There are two pillars to this. One is the structures and systems themselves and how they've developed, but the other is the narratives and the stories that we're told around that. What are the ideologies that shore this up? What is it about our culture that denigrates poorer people or people on benefits, that is content to label people as lazy or as undeserving, while other people, supposedly hardworking people, as if poorer people don't work hard, are deserving of the fruits of our society? I'm not saying I have loads of answers to the questions that lots of people have, but I do know this. I know that for as long as we accept the way that people are painted, as if they're undeserving, as if they're not whole and valid members of our society, the systems that are in place that keep people down will continue to stay in place. Institutions are built to serve certain groups of people. At the moment, they're not built to serve working class people and people especially on benefits. I would consider myself, my heritage being of benefits class, and the first time I heard that term was from a Northern Irish playwright and director called Cat Woods, and I felt it described a subsector within the working classes that is even more denigrated and diminished, and that leaves a long-standing impact on people from those backgrounds. Inequality is entrenched by the sorts of attitudes and the stigma that comes with denigrating people who are poorer or on benefits or in need of welfare support. For as long as those narratives are strong and are pushed by people with power, the systems that we currently have will stay in place. You know, for as long as the public are convinced and constantly persuaded that people who need some assistance or support at some point in their lives don't deserve it, then these systems stay in place. COVID and the pandemic opened a lot of people's eyes to these systems, opened people's eyes to the threadbare welfare system through the universal credit debacle, for example. We have a window where the public can change the way we think and feel about those who are less well off in our society, those without access to the resources that they need just to live a decent life, just to have the chances that other people take for granted. I think we absolutely have to challenge these structures. We have to challenge the inequalities that permeate our society. The onus is on those of us with experience who are able to speak up, And that's sort of what I try to do through my work all the time, as someone with lived experience of poverty, who's seen what it does firsthand. And I really do hope that as we come out of this pandemic, more people see the systems for what they are and see the nonsense that is the way people who are in need are described. I'm sorry I can't speak for longer, and I really wish I could take your questions here today. Obviously I can't, but please feel free to direct message me on Twitter if you have any questions about my work. But in the meantime, have a great festival, because this is an amazing thing that's happening here. Thank you very much.
Great, so that was Mary O'Hara. Just a reminder that she is making herself available on Twitter today at 5 p.m. So if there's anything that she said there that you wanted to just ask a question, follow up on, please do. I'm sure she would appreciate it. I'm also really grateful for that because I feel like it sort of sets the tone for what's coming next. As Mary says, I mean, not me, but these guys, they've been dedicated their entire life to studying how this rift, this ever great rift between those who have and have not has grown, in whose interests it serves, how the pandemic has played into this. Mary said there, I claim not to have the answers to questions that you might have. I think that's fair to say. We won't solve it today, but it is really a great pleasure to have them here. And not least because even if a working class writer is talking about the wind through the trees, that experience of power and poverty, it finds its way into the words. So I really think it's very relevant to have these great academic minds here to talk about it at this festival. So, Paul, you're up. You're going to kickstart our live presentations, so I will just defer to you.
Thank you. Lots to think about from what Mary said. As a filmmaker, I make documentaries. A lot of that work is focused on inequalities. The first film I made was about a band, but it was also about austerity. It followed a band called Sleaford Mods on a tour of the UK in the run-up to the 2015 general election, and as well as, focusing on that band whose lyrics and whose ethos, addresses inequality and talks about, this, I suppose, the people that feel disenfranchised by politics, by culture. Making that film was about them, but it was also about those kind of people in those kind of areas around the country that feel that they don't have a voice. And I think while we were making that film, we focused on different areas. We looked at deindustrialization, which is a big cause of inequality. We were going to look at Brexit. This was 2015, and in the end, we didn't include any of that in the film because it was just such a big subject. But going around the country and meeting people, you could tell that Brexit was coming. A few people predicted Brexit, but I think it's very important that, a lot of people will say, it was the working class that caused Brexit. I don't think it was. I mean, Danny Dorling's research tells us that it was also a high degree of, southern middle class voters. But one thing you got a sense of going around the country, as I have a few times, is just a general sense of people feeling that they're not heard, and that's across the political spectrum. For me, becoming a filmmaker, I did it quite late on in life. I was about 38, 39 by the time I started making films. And we were talking a bit about this earlier. When, you're young, because a couple of people on this panel, I think maybe all of us, were the first in our families to go to university. And I think sometimes when you're working class, and this isn't a generalization for everyone, but you're told what you can't do. You can't do this, you can't do that, don't get ideas above your station. As my mum was told, my mum wanted to be a teacher. My nan, as soon as she was 16, said, go and get a job. And my mum, as a single parent, made sacrifices so I could go to university. And I think if you're middle class, that doesn't necessarily happen. I mean, if you're middle class, if you're upper class, you're kind of told what you can do. And so for me, becoming a filmmaker was never something that was possible because, going to film school costs a lot of money. Back then, buying equipment cost a lot of money. And so I came to it quite late, but I think that was probably for the best. It gave me an understanding of why I want to tell stories. And I want to tell stories, where we work with the people that they're about. I think films, TV shows, they can change society, but often they can change society in very negative ways. And, you look at some of the poverty porn shows, Benefit Street, Council House Crackdown, those kind of programs were the inspiration for making my second film, which was called Dispossession, which was about social housing. And I remember, watching David Cameron, remember him, on TV talking about sink estates and this blanket generalisation and denigration of people that live in council housing. And, I grew up on an estate, and what he was saying was not the memories that I had of living in southeast London. I think programs like that are very damaging because, these caricatures and the people themselves are often taken advantage of. And so I think it's important that we have narratives where we can tell our own stories, where we represent people faithfully, rather than making TV that, let's admit it, it is popular with a working class audience because it's on TV, it's often on at a prime time. The characters, as they're described, are often framed in such a way that they are interesting to watch, but it's very, very irresponsible. And I think that one of the things that we need to do, as a class, is have more power, more influence in the media. We need to tell our stories, we need to tell them with one another, we need to shout louder. And I think it's getting better. There are lots of schemes, but I think one of the problems is you can have all the schemes in the world, but until you have paid work placements for people rather than internships, because a lot of people on low incomes can't afford, even if they get in those positions where they can, be an intern, they can't afford to live on those salaries. So I think, for me, it's not about getting into a position where you're able to say to somebody, there's the ladder. You have to say, there's the ladder, you have to stand by that ladder, and you have to put your hand down, and you have to help them up and support them. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do as a filmmaker, is to, work with people that have a similar ethos in that way. Because I do think it's very key to telling these stories. And as Mary was saying, a lot of the stigma around poverty is because we see this on our TV. We read this in the newspapers. We shame people. And Mary's book is very good on that, The Shame Game, to talk about her own experience. And I'm sure if Mary was here, she would tell you a story about when she was a little girl and she wanted to go to this disco and she had to save up to buy the entry fee and everything else. And it's Mary's story to tell, so hopefully you'll get to hear it from her one day. But I know Mary, she's a friend, and it's very important, I think, that we we have more control, we have more influence of culture, because it's strange when you're working class, and it's still, for me, you know, the space I work in as a filmmaker, you know, you go to BFI South Bank and it's a middle class space. I mean, if you're a working class kid and you go to the BFI South Bank, you do not feel welcome. You know, they don't sell popcorn. They don't, you feel, even, you know, I didn't go to an art house cinema probably until I was in my 20s, because they're intimidating spaces, and that has to change. And I think, for me, a lot of, you know, it's not just levels of inequality or poverty, it's cultural things. It's things like food. I mean, when I was a kid, my second girlfriend, my first girlfriend was working class, but she dumped me. My second girlfriend was middle class. I dumped her. But I remember the first time I went to her house, and it was really weird, because sitting there having dinner with her mum, and there were these jars on the walls and these weird different coloured shapes in them. And I was like, what's that? And her mum was like, it's pasta. And I'd never seen that before, because we had spaghetti, which is obviously one colour, it's one shape. You know, what's all these weird shapes? And it made me feel ashamed. And occasionally, as you get older and you are in these middle-class spaces, you have to adapt, you know, your understanding. But why should we? You know, why can't we be who we are? Why can't they adapt more to us? But I think I've spoken for 5 minutes, so that's enough from me.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to slightly break the rules, because I wanted to ask you a follow-up question.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you whether you felt that, and I can only speak in terms of my own industry, which is journalism, and from what I understand, it's getting worse in terms of the class divide, unfortunately. I remember being on this kind of cross-newspaper panel where we looked at just levels of attainment, background, jobs, income, private schooling, and yeah, there was a kind of moment where it looked like it was getting better around sort of 2015, 2014, and steadily it's declined. And I wanted to know if that was the same in the world of film. I think back to some, you know, legendary filmmakers, you know, Ken Loach springs to mind, and even just this era of really brilliant cinema, British filmmaking around the working class experience. I can't think of any now in the last 15 years, but I'm not an expert. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound correct?
Yeah, I mean, film, like most of the arts, is very, you know, I think probably the percentage of working class filmmakers is probably very low, probably under 10%. I mean, there's people out there like Lynn Ramsey who have become very successful and who make work that is empathic. Obviously, there's Ken Loach who's still out there, and there are other people, but there's also a very high percentage of people, particularly, well, not just working class people, but a lot of them who make one film, and then I think it's something like 67% of people that make one film never go on to make a second film.
Oh, wow.
Because it is very difficult. It's hard not just if you're a director, but if you're an editor, if you're a producer, because often you don't have, you know, money to fall back on. You don't have the mum and dad. So the film industry is probably just as bad as the publishing industry, the music industry, any other kind of arts form. I mean, it's very nepotistic, and there are schemes, but I mean, schemes aren't enough, because, you know, you need paid work placements that go after the scheme. Right, you've now got a job, because you know you don't have the time or the space to just be able to do nothing while you make a film. You've always got to have like a side hustle.
Yeah, and it feels like as well you have these little moments where the gatekeepers will be like, "Oh God, this is awful," and they'll create a scheme, or they'll do things to effectively, like, you know, forgive me, Father, to clear their consciences, and then any slight bit of, you know, we're talking about journalism. Yes, of course, the pandemic was a great excuse for many publishers just to say, no more schemes, don't have the money, no more schemes. It's not important anymore. It's as though equality is a luxury, not something that should be baked in. But there's always some crisis, isn't it? Before the pandemic, there was, you know, the referendum. Before that, there was another one. Yeah, and I do that stat about filmmakers never going on to make another one. I wonder if it's because those ones at the beginning got a foot in the door when people were caring, and then they stopped. Is that too cynical? No,
I think you know, you probably hit the nail on the head there. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why you wouldn't make a second film. I mean, some people make a film and find it traumatic and never want to do it again. I mean, I've made 4, and it is traumatic sometimes, but it's not as traumatic as, you know, living in poverty and dealing with any other untold things, and I prefer it to working in shops and in bars, as I did for many years. So, yeah, I think it does need to improve, and it needs to improve beyond the schemes. It's also a very male world. It's also a very white world. So it's not just class. It's across race, class, and gender, and disability. You know, if you want to sort of take a microcosm of inequality, the film industry is a very good place to start.
Wonderful. So thank you, Paul. Again, questions for Paul. I know you all have them now, but we have to save them to the end, I'm afraid. So Stewart, I'm going to go to you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. The work that I've been doing recently on inequality is actually been looking at the history of the relationship between inequality and poverty since 1800, over the last 200 years. I just want to start actually in the mid-Victorian age, when an American businessman and social reformer came on a fact-finding tour to Britain. And this was his conclusion: there is sullen hopelessness, haggard wretchedness, ignorance, brutality. He gave this incredible description of a Britain that was so divided, in which such a high proportion of the population lived in appalling conditions. If we fast forward to today, nearly 200 years, as many of you will know, there was another visit to Britain by Philip Alston, who is a UN rapporteur on poverty. He used slightly more moderate language, but I mean, he told a very, very similar story. These are the kind of words he used. What he discovered was misery, marginalization, distorted values. So there's nothing natural about extreme levels of inequality or extreme levels of poverty. They are essentially a choice that society has taken. And there's lots of evidence. There's no reason why we should choose to have highly unequal societies, because all the evidence, whether it's about the impact on society, or whether it's ethical, or whether it's the impact on the economy or social mobility, all the evidence is very, very clear that inequality is pretty well bad. Inequality of the kind of levels that we have today is pretty bad on virtually every criteria. I just want to look very quickly at two measures by which we might measure the state of Britain. The first is comparing Britain with other rich countries. And Britain is the second highest unequal country after the United States in the world. This is countries of a similar stage of development. If you look at the poorest fifth in Britain and compare their incomes with the poorest fifth in other European countries, which have a very similar level of income per person, the poorest 20% in Britain are 33% poorer than the equivalent group in Germany, and they're between 20 and 25% poorer than countries like France, Italy, Scandinavian countries, so on. If we take another measure of Britain's record, if we look simply at the last 40 years, the mid-1970s was a period of peak equality in Britain. We had also had the lowest rate of poverty since the war. Since then, both inequality and poverty rates have surged. So just take child poverty. The level of child poverty in the mid-1970s was 14%. I mean, that's still pretty bad, but it's a good deal better than we have today. It's more than double that. It's 31% and rising. So we have 1 in 3 children in Britain being brought up in the official definition of poverty. So what we are in a wave which I've called a high inequality, high poverty wave. And if you look back over the last 200 years, what we've had is a cycle of poverty and inequality. The two go together. And there's been 3 waves. There's the period up to 1939, which is 140 years. That was a period of extreme inequality and extreme poverty. Then we had a second wave after the war, when there were, the combination of social reforms and full employment and the post-war boom and so on, led to much lower levels of inequality and poverty. And then the neoliberal revolution, which changed the way we run economies, has led to a third wave, this time a very high inequality, high poverty wave. Now, there's been a long tradition in Britain of writers both British writers and overseas, coming and, writing about the state of Britain. So there's George Orwell and J.B. Priestley. There was Anthony Sampson, who, from the sort of late 1970s started writing actually about the plutocracy, about the ruling classes and so on. So we have these portraits. Now, if any of they're all dead now, of course, but if any of these writers were to come back today, and they were to paint a sort of simple portrait of Britain, what would they say? Well, let's have a look. They would discover that the health gap between rich and poor has actually grown over the last 40 years. They'd find that the rate of life expectancy that has been rising continuously for the last 200 years has actually stalled in the last few years. This is pre-COVID, so it's not to do with COVID. And the most deprived communities, it's actually been going down. If we look at the types of jobs that are available, there are fewer decent, well-paid, reasonably paid jobs that offer security, with just much fewer numbers compared with 20 or 30 years ago. If we look at Britain's social security system, all benefit, apart from pensioners, but for working age adults, benefits have been slashed in real terms in the last decade. So let's just take child benefit, for example. The value of child benefit has fallen by a quarter since 2010. Britain is a society where the state has effectively abdicated a big chunk of its responsibility for protecting its citizens. And what they've done is to pass this responsibility to society as a whole. They pass it to charities, to food banks, churches, and so on. Britain is a country that does not follow the linear theory of history. The linear theory of history is that as societies get richer, the progress will be shared broadly equally. So each generation will have more choices, more opportunities, a better living standard. We haven't followed that law over the last 40 years. I mean, some people, in fact, probably about 2/3 of society have been getting better off. But there's another third where, if anything, their opportunities and life chances have been going into reverse. So there's a lot of a talk at the moment, isn't there, about creating a better post-COVID society, although perhaps a little bit less than at the very beginning. But if we are to build a post-COVID society, and all the evidence suggests we're not at the moment, I mean, the trends, if anything, are getting worse in some areas, we have to break this cycle. This second wave, the first one lasted 140 years. The low inequalities, low poverty cycle lasted a single generation. And this current wave has lasted 4 decades and shows no sign of abating. And to me, the measure of whether we are able to create a better society is completely dependent on breaking that cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Stewart. That was unbelievably rousing and enraging and brilliant. I really, really appreciate it. I wrote so many things down, and I know that I'm breaking the rules by asking you questions when we are saving them to the end. But one thing you said, which was about plutocracy, and that word really got to me. And I've often asked myself, what word would you describe Britain as today in terms of a cracy? I know that's a very big one. I just was curious. In your works, have you ever identified one?
Well, I mean, Britain was a plutocracy throughout most of the Victorian, throughout most of the 18th century. It was a society run by the rich for the rich. Gradually, we changed that. Spread of democracy, the building better social protection and so on. But what's happened is we don't have a plutocracy on the scale that we had in the 19th century, in the sense that the rich sit in Parliament and pass the laws, but we have a plutocracy by default because these people exercise massive power. If you take some of the, Britain is increasingly a monopolistic business society, i.e., the wealth and capital and business is owned and run by a small group of people. And if you look at, all the tech giants are monopolies. That's the reason why Mark Zuckerberg and all the rest of them are so fantastically rich and so fantastically powerful and refuse to pay their taxes and so on, is because they've created monopolies, and they've done that deliberately. So I don't think we would call Britain a plutocracy in the sense of the 19th century, but it is in effect, i.e., that so many of the decisions that are taken have the effect of enriching the few at the expense of the labour force, at the expense of the taxpayer, at the expense of the resilience of local communities. But I haven't got a single word, I'm afraid.
I interpreted that as plutocracy, so I'm going with plutocracy. But don't worry, I won't quote you. I know that's too simplistic, but you know me, I love it's good in a headline, isn't it? Okay, and our final panellist, certainly not the least, though the last, is Yunis. I'm just going to defer straight to you.
Thank you. So like the other panelists, I'm very grateful, and I use this word consciously, privileged. I feel very privileged to be here, and many thanks to those who have been organising this event and for you guys being here. It's been really interesting listening to the other panelists and Mary as well. And I've kind of deviated. I was making notes and I had thoughts about, what I should say to introduce myself. So the first thing I'll say is, you said at the outset, no swearing. And I thought, shit, no swearing. And then I thought something else, but I won't repeat that. So what I'm going to say, it comes from my own. So please do excuse the current catchphrases. I'm kind of using them, some of them a bit cynically. It comes from my own lived experience. Okay, so my own lived experience is someone who was born and brought up in a kind of working class part of a working class, largely working class city in the north of England, Bradford in West Yorkshire. My parents were, at one point in their lives, Indians, and then they became Pakistanis, but at the same time they were also British subjects. Then they became immigrants, then they became fully British nationals, and then they had a family of which I was a part. So I was born and brought up in the city. I went through the educational system, kind of bummed around a bit, did a number of, proper jobs. I was asked to leave school because I wasn't fully on at that point. So yeah, I worked in interesting places, and that kind of gave me a lot of experience, I guess, in terms of how I thought the world worked. And then for some reason, I still can't remember why, I thought I'd try university. So I did a degree. And it was remarkable at two different levels. One was, I didn't want to go to university when I was at school, because as human beings, we have a fear of the unknown, I think. And university was unknown to me. It was completely uncharted. The school that I went to was quite mixed in terms of ethnic diversity. It was majority white, and it was out in the sticks a little bit. A lot of the kids were, I would say, middle-class heritage. Some of the kids came from my neck of the woods, which was kind of frontline, working class, very ethnically diverse. And kids like me, we got one kind of talk from the careers teacher, and the other kids kind of got a different talk. And the big distinction was, what kind of business are you going to open up if you're of BME heritage? Are you going to work in a mill? Which I ended up doing, actually. And if you were white, it was like, what are your options for your A-levels and then what you're going to do as a university student. That's a bit of a simplification, but generally speaking, that was kind of the tenor of that experience. So for me, university was a kind of weird idea, unknown. And the interesting thing is, it dawned on me when I visited my university to become a student, that I realized I've actually been here before. When I was about 14 or 15, a friend of mine said, "Do you want to go listen to some music?" And I said, "Well, all right." He said, "There's a concert." So we went to this concert, and it was a big open-air concert, and it was really good. We went because my friend was friends with a band. It was a kind of ska band, and he wanted to see them perform, and I was into ska as well, so we watched them perform. There were all sorts of different eclectic performers, punk, jazz, rock, whatever. And then about 10 years later, I'm on campus, and I'm like, shit, I've been here before, but I didn't even know it was the university at the time. So that's the distance between me then, as a 15-year-old kid, and a kind of middle-class trajectory. Regardless, I ended up in university, and I really enjoyed it, partly because I had some really good academics. They were good lecturers. They were very good at, and they knew what they were doing, and they were very sensitive to pretty much everything. I kind of did a political sciences degree as an undergrad. And it was very, very interesting. And at the time I was doing my undergrad degree, I was writing fiction just to help me learn how to write more precisely. And in my second year of being an undergrad, I wrote a novel, and it was published, and then I carried on writing novels and fiction. By the time I graduated, I was invited to do some work for some of the colleagues who had been teaching me, some of the academics. And throughout that process, up until quite recently, I've been in that game for about 20 years now, I always felt quite insecure, always felt like something of an imposter. And it's only through a series of kind of reflections and conversations with other colleagues that I realized I'm not the only one. And the reason for I wouldn't say they're anxieties as such, but feeling as if somebody's going to kind of tap me on the shoulder and say, right, the gig is up, off you go, is because it comes from my lack of, so this is the language of sort of social sciences a bit, lack of social and cultural capital. And it speaks to the points that the other panelists are speaking about as well, in terms of you don't necessarily have all the expectations. You're told what you can't do rather than what you can do. And even if you're not told what you can do, there is communication by exception almost. The things that aren't included in the conversations become default. Now, speaking more generally about some of the points, particularly in relation to the theme of this event, there are a couple of things. One is, and again, people have been mentioning this, but they haven't quite named it, I think. So forgive me if I've misunderstood. There's a kind of an elephant in the room, and one element of the elephant in the room is ideology, really. So, and it kind of speaks to some of my politics as well, but at one point, Karl Marx, who was never really as funny as Groucho, in my view, his son, wasn't his son, he says something like, the ideas of, in every epoch, the dominant or the ruling ideas are the ideas of the dominant or ruling class. So that isn't merely economic. That is about culture. That is how cultural ideas, values, norms, expectations are transmitted. That is why we have outsiders. That is why we have others. That is why there is a perennial other who shifts. When I was a kid, it was people who have African Caribbean heritage. Bristol knows this. You guys had a riot in 1980 here. There were riots in the 60s. There was a riot during the Second World War, all around race. Flash forward 10, 15 years after that, it's single mums. Then it's Roma. Then it's people who do raves, or it's mods, or whatever. So when I talk about ideology, I think the moment that we're in is a version of capitalism which is, to our minds, perhaps unsustainable. But actually, inequality is woven into the system. You need inequality in order for this type of capitalism to survive. And I think, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. Just look around, listen. We know about the discourse. It was kind of before and during COVID and all that. 0-hour contracts. You listen to reasonable people. Amongst the people who have inspired me, people like Ken Loach, and Jeremy Corbyn, didn't actually make a lot of radical departures from what were traditional sort of Labour ideas. Vilified, absolutely pilloried, for talking about addressing inequality as something that is not only systematic, but it is systemic. And that's an important difference. Inequality is woven into the system, and it affects those, your bottom 20%, affects those who are already to some extent marginalized by virtue of their identity, whether it's ethnicity, disability, whatever. The problem is, I think, some of that is attended to in a rather superficial, not particularly effective way, whether it's legislation. There's Equalities Act. It has protected characteristics. Think about how that actually rolls out in the real world and what impact it actually serves. Throughout the UK, there are institutions. Many of them are huge. Many of them are public sector institutions. You look at those institutions. I count my own institution. Universities are really good at this. They're really good at saying, we've got a very diverse ethnic workforce, for example. But where does that diversity occur? It occurs invariably at the bottom. The further up you go, the more white it becomes, the more middle class it becomes, and the more male it becomes. Let's be honest. When is that going to change? Our students, for example, in universities, the profile has changed remarkably over the last 20 years. Arguably through people like Tony Blair, who was just a continuation of Thatcher. Thatcher is somebody who said there is no such thing as society. What does that tell you? We are all individuals. We all have agentic power. There is no such thing as structure, which is complete bullshit. It cannot be otherwise. And yet that narrative continues, pervades. You do you. Focus on you. How can you change and how... it's not a million miles away from Tebbit stuff about, get on your bike, do something with your lives, pull up your socks. That kind of Tory individualism, it's owned by those who are oppressed by it. So for me, unfortunately, I'm not a real solutions person. I'm a real dick when it comes to being cynical, unfortunately. And I remain cynical. I am grateful, however, that there are people who are much more positive than I am about, creating change, making society better, making it fairer, making it more harmonious and everything. But frankly, the machine of plutocracy masquerading as democracy, perhaps, which makes very comfortable bedfellows with the version of capitalism that we have, is a big one to switch off. It's a very difficult, large lever to pull. Thank you. Apologies for the rant.
First of all, no apologies necessary. Second of all, I once again wrote a lot of things down, wrote down empty representation, how neoliberalism feeds into identity, tokenism. But my question that I'm going to ask you, while everyone prepares theirs, because we are going to go to Q&As now, is you mentioned at the beginning that you have imposter syndrome. I think that's something that many of us in this room can relate to. I think we can all relate to it. I still have it all the time. And I'm like, how can I still feel like an imposter? How can it still be going on? Do you still feel like an imposter?
Well, it's interesting because I apologized, right? And that's a very working class thing to do, I think. It comes out in all sorts of mannerisms and so on. And it's interesting. I was talking to in my university, I was talking to quite senior people who are kind of managers and academics, but they're managers. And they kind of commented on that. They said, you know, you're not very good at selling yourself. You're not very good at promoting yourself. So I'm like, dude, I'm lucky to be here. I mean, I genuinely feel like I'm quite lucky to be paid as an academic, because it is completely out with my vista 20-odd, 30 years ago. You know, I never imagined I'd be in university. I never imagined I'd be published. So it's something that we kind of, I mean, well, I don't know if it's a bad thing. I mean, it helps me check myself. It helps
Makes things fun, though, isn't it? Because if you're like, actually, this is a wild ride, and nobody realises I'm having it makes it a bit more fun, no?
I mean, it can be, but it can also be quite uncomfortable when and this is not an example of this, by the way, of having to kind of explain yourself to people who don't speak your language. So that's what I'm talking about. There are all these subtle divides, even in terms of the words we use. You know, and I've had fellow working class academics saying, "Oh, you're all right at it. You can kind of do the performance." But that's taken a long time to learn. And then the question you ask of yourself, well, which is the real me? You know, so you have all sorts of questions around. I mean, I don't necessarily lose sleep over it or get neurotic about it, but it is interesting to think about. You know, what have I become? You know, ostensibly in terms of economic, I'm middle class. And I still like to kid myself, perhaps, that I've got a working class outlook. And before you come back in, just very quick.
No, you go ahead.
When I was an undergrad, one of my lecturers dared to suggest that all the people in the room, we've all got a middle class trajectory. You know, by the time you've graduated and you've gone into a world of work, you're going to get middle class jobs by virtue of the fact that you've got degrees. And I nearly had a fight with this guy. You know, I was like, talking about? This is ridiculous. I am who I am. You're and it became quite, because he was speaking about my identity, and I was very sort of wedded to that. I'm a bit more relaxed about it now, but, you know, I'm perhaps open to the idea that maybe I kind of can do some boundary work or something. You know, I can straddle more than one identity, and that's what we all are, right? We all different things at different times. Anyway,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking that a way to do this might be, because I'm conscious of time, let's do it in order. So has anyone got a question for Paul? Let's go to Paul first. Anyone? So just to remind you that Paul is a filmmaker. This lady over here, please.
Nice one, thank you. It's fine. I'll get it. Cheers.
Hiya. Thanks so much. I mean, this is to you, Paul, because I was going to ask about filmmaking specifically, but I think there's definitely, as well as the lack of finance and that kind of thing, there's an element of self-deselection, especially in the creative industries for people with working class backgrounds. And really, I just wondered, what would you attribute your success to? What kept you going through the imposter syndrome? What was different, what was useful, and how might we be able to support other people to have that kind of success?
Yeah, I suppose two things really. One, you know, as I was kind of coming up, there were a lot of people around me that were working class that gave me lots of advice and support. One of them is called Mia Bays, who's a working class woman who is now head of the BFI Film Fund, and it's a massive thing for someone like that to be head of that fund. And I guess I hate giving up. I've got a natural tenacity, and yeah, it's difficult. I mean, that's a strength and it's a weakness, because sometimes you should just give up on things, and I probably should have given up on a couple of film projects that I didn't. But I think you need people around you. You need people that understand you and get you and value you, especially in the film business, because you'll get any number of notes from people with, you know, a number of different opinions, and you can divide them into two types. One are taste notes, or things that they do or don't like, and the other are technical notes, things that may or may not improve the film. And there's a lot of people that sit there and come up from being working class or whatever else, from, you know, marginalised groups, that listen to these taste notes and don't follow what they really want to do. So my advice to anyone is find allies, you know, and if there's anyone in here that is thinking of going into making a film, then, you know, if we get on, then I'll be your ally. Find more of them, and, you know, let's have more of us in that world.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have a question for Stewart here? Great.
Hi. Yeah, I was thinking about what you were saying, and something I've been thinking about recently about what's going on is it feels a little bit like the ruling class are colonizing their own country now. It's like they're pauperizing it. They're taking away all our rights, and any sort of opposition to it is just being legislated against. And I suppose the big question I've been grappling with particularly over the last month, is just a complete lack of accountability that the political system now has, that there's no way of holding any of it to account. It's like they can give huge amounts of money to corporations for PPE, for example. They actually use our money to refuse freedom of information requests or to like defend themselves against us. And when I was thinking about it in that colonial frame, you know, of what they're actually doing, it's like the resistance seems to be you have to have like an anti-colonial movement in order to get rid of them. And I wonder, you know, do you see, or is there anything that you can think about how this system can be held how to account now in order, you know, with all the failings that we're seeing like related to the inequality?
Well, I mean, I agree with you. Actually, it suddenly occurred to me that you know, maybe a word to describe the present system is not plutocracy, but plutonomy, i.e., a society in which, you know, the owners of capital exercise such a level of power that they are able to prevent the state from affecting them, and they are able to pay themselves, you know, an absurdly too high share of the benefits of the economy. So, but in terms, I think what you're saying is that, and also, of course, a lot of the methods they do this are very subtle, they're very hidden, totally unaccountable. And of course, we've had a pretty deregulated economy now, particularly in finance. And there's absolutely no doubt that the 2008 crash was a product of two things. It was a product of inequality because, you know, lower income families couldn't afford to finance a basic living. So what they did is borrow. So there was a massive increase in debt between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s. I mean, it went from like 70% of the economy to 180%. And the finance also, as well as having this power to finance is at the root of a lot of our problems. And until we saw, I mean, what I call it extractive capitalism, what they do is they extract existing wealth and a too high share of new wealth for themselves. And we see, I mean, so many of our economic policies do that. Quantitative easing, you know, does that. Private equity takeovers do that. Mergers and acquisitions do that. Privatization did that. I mean, there's dozens of ways. Share buybacks. There's so many ways in which the rich are enriching themselves even more at the expense of the rest of society. So your question, I think, is, can we do anything about it? Can we get social movements? I mean, I don't think we'll get change without social movements. You've got to the public have got to demand. I mean, we do have lots of active pressure groups, you know, campaigning on the living wage, campaigning against, you know, the local loss of jobs and factories and so on. So we do have, and we have new trade unions that, you know, that didn't exist 10 years ago that are mobilizing in some of the new low-paid jobs and so on. But what we don't really have is a political movement, the Labour Party, you know, that is essentially building hope, offering, you know, a vision of a better society. And until we get that, I'm not sure. I mean, I share Yunis's, you know, pessimism to some degree, but not quite as much, because we have had change before. We can have change again. And I think Yunis is right when he says capitalism is essentially self-destructive. And it will self-destructed in 2008, and it will self-destruct again. So eventually capitalism has got to accept some moderation itself. Otherwise, it just won't survive.
It's a zombie, though, isn't it? It just keeps coming back.
It does keep coming back, but so, I mean, after the war, it did come back in a better form. I mean, not perfect, and loads of criticism, all the rest of it, but at least all sections of society did share in economic growth after the war.
But you had sort of Beveridge in between, and that kind of had a pronounced impact on the kind of culture, if you like. And again, it was. Apologies for sort of talking through.
No.
But I think we'll have another.
I think
afterwards. Yeah, it'll be interesting.
I'm running out of paper, so if you could all be less intelligent and less inspiring, that would be really fantastic. Any questions for Yunis, please? Oh, wow. Lots of hands. Who should we have this lady? Actually, you had a question too. Can we do all of them, guys? Can we get all three in?
We've just probably got 5 minutes now, yeah, because we've got speed pitching in.
Of course, yeah. Okay. Should we start with the young lady here, and then if we have time, we'll go to these gentlemen here.
Thanks. Hopefully mine will be quick. You said that inequality is systemic and systematic, and I don't know the difference between them,
Okay.
so would you explain it to me?
Sure, great. So by systemic, I mean it is woven within the system, within the processes. It is the fabric of the culture, if you like. Systematic refers to the actual individual steps within that process whereby forms of discrimination occur. I'm not sure if that's helpful. Okay, thank you. Good question.
We have this gentleman here in the green.
A question for Stewart, really. Obviously, we haven't had enough on how do we tackle inequality in the UK, and I can see why we haven't had enough on that. But I was interested in a couple of things, really. You talked about the period after the Second World War in this country, where it seems like inequality was reduced under both Labour and Conservative governments. And I'd also, to move it on, the recent Blair and Brown series on BBC Two, wherever it was, suggested that in Gordon Brown's time there was a kind of reduction of inequality by stealth. Could you talk about that a bit more?
Well, I mean, the Labour Party traditionally has been an egalitarian party. I mean, its early leaders were egalitarian. The 1945 government, introduced a lot of egalitarian measures. The Wilson government tried to make it more egalitarian, but had lots of economic difficulties. The thing about New Labour and Tony Blair is Tony Blair abandoned the equality objective of the Labour Party. He made it very clear that he thought you can tackle poverty. And to be fair to Labour then, they did reduce poverty. But they also allowed inequality. That is simply wrong to say that inequality fell between 1997 and 2010. It didn't. The top 1% increased their share of income by 3 percentage points. Poverty fell. What they did is achieve a fall in poverty, but in the last 3 years it started rising again because economic pressures, they cut public spending, I mean, all sorts of pressure. And of course what happened is that they didn't make it systemic. They didn't make pro-equality and anti-poverty systemic in a way that would be difficult to remove. So as soon as the Tories came in, they just dismantled and poverty started shooting up again.
Great. I'm afraid we are out of time. I'm not sure if that QR code went up. Did it go up? Do we know? Okay. Well, there should be, throughout the event, you'll see a QR code. That's for the survey. Please fill it in. Please say wonderful things, because we'd love to keep it going year after year. Thank you so much for your time. And just a reminder, in this room will be speed pitching. If you have an idea for a book, why not test it out on someone?
There's spaces left, so yeah, let us know.
Great. Thank you, everyone.